Today, we're going to look at how some of the most infamous serial killers in history actually died. And we start right now with number 1. Ted Bundy was executed on January 24, 1989 in Florida. He was 42 years old. But to understand why his death drew so much attention, we need to go back. Between 1974 and 1978, Ted Bundy carried out a series of murders across the United States. He was officially convicted for 30 victims, though investigators and Bundy himself suggested the true number was higher. His crimes stretched across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida, showing a rare level of mobility for the time. Bundy approached his victims in public places, often appearing harmless before isolating and overpowering them. He was arrested multiple times, escaped custody more than once, and continued killing even while under investigation. His final arrest came in Florida in 1978, after witnesses identified him in connection with the murders of 2 women at a sorority house. The case quickly became national news. Bundy chose to represent himself in court, turning his trial into one of the first major televised criminal proceedings in U.S. His calm demeanor and confidence disturbed the public, especially as graphic evidence was presented. Despite his attempts to manipulate the courtroom, the verdict was clear. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to death by electric chair. In the days before his execution, Bundy remained composed. He spoke at length with investigators, confessing to murders but still withholding details, even at the end. On the morning of January 24, 1989, at Florida State Prison, Bundy was escorted into the execution chamber at 7:06 a.m. Witnesses included prison officials, journalists, and relatives of victims. He was strapped into the electric chair. Electrodes were placed on his leg and scalp. His final words were brief. When the switch was thrown, 2,000 volts surged through his body for nearly a full minute. Witnesses later reported the smell of burning material filling the room. At 7:16 a.m., a prison physician pronounced him dead. Outside the prison, hundreds had gathered overnight. When the news broke, the crowd celebrated, chanting and lighting fireworks. For many, it marked the definitive end of a man who had manipulated victims, media, and the justice system for years. Ted Bundy's execution remains one of the most infamous in American history. Jeffrey Dahmer, often referred to as the Milwaukee Cannibal, never faced execution. His death came from inside the prison walls. Before that, his crimes had already left the United States in shock. Between 1978 and 1991, Dahmer was responsible for the murders of 17 young men and teenagers, primarily in Wisconsin, with most of the crimes taking place in Milwaukee. He targeted vulnerable individuals, often meeting them in bars or public spaces and inviting them back to his apartment. Once inside, Dahmer used a calculated routine. He drugged his victims, restrained them, and carried out his crimes in private, hidden from neighbors living just feet away. For years, he managed to operate unnoticed, even when victims tried to escape. In one of the most infamous failures in criminal history, police once returned a 14-year-old victim to Dahmer after he convinced officers it was a domestic dispute. That mistake allowed him to continue killing. His arrest finally came in July 1991, when a victim escaped and led police back to Dahmer's apartment. Inside, investigators discovered photographs, remains, and evidence so disturbing that seasoned officers reportedly struggled to process the scene. The case immediately drew massive media attention. Dahmer confessed in detail. He showed little emotion and did not attempt to deny his actions. In 1992, he was convicted and sentenced to 16 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released. Unlike many others, there was no death penalty. The state chose permanent incarceration. In prison, Dahmer kept a low profile. He was described as quiet, compliant, and often isolated, but his presence caused tension among other inmates. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was assigned to clean a prison gym bathroom alongside Christopher Scarver and another inmate. The 3 men were left unsupervised for several minutes. When guards returned, Dahmer was found collapsed on the floor, suffering from severe head injuries. The second inmate was also badly injured. Scarver later admitted responsibility. He told investigators he had used a metal bar taken from gym equipment to strike Dahmer. According to Scarver, the attack was not impulsive, but deliberate. He claimed he acted under divine instruction, saying he believed God had directed him to carry out the act because of Dahmer's crimes and the way he spoke about them in prison. Dahmer was transported to a nearby hospital, but was pronounced dead approximately 1 hour later. He was 34 years old. His death sparked immediate debate. Some viewed it as inevitable prison violence. Others saw it as an unofficial form of justice. Dahmer's body was cremated. Even after his death, controversy followed, including disputes over whether his brain should be preserved for study. Jeffrey Dahmer's story remains one of the most disturbing examples of how long extreme crimes can go unnoticed. The execution of John Wayne Gacy, often referred to as the Killer Clown, was widely criticized, and there was a reason for that. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy was responsible for the murders of 33 teenage boys and young men in Illinois. Many of his victims disappeared after last being seen with him. Behind a public image of a successful contractor and community volunteer, Gacy led a double life. Most of his victims were assaulted and killed inside his home, then buried in the crawl space beneath his house. Others were disposed of in nearby rivers. His arrest came in December 1978 after a sustained investigation linked multiple disappearances directly to him. When police searched his home, they uncovered human remains beneath the floor. The scale of the crimes shocked the country. Gacy was convicted in 1980 on 33 counts of murder and sentenced to death. For more than a decade, he remained on death row while appeals moved slowly through the courts. On May 10, 1994, Gacy was brought to the execution chamber in Illinois. He had spent the day meeting with a Catholic priest. For his final meal, he requested fried chicken, shrimp, French fries, strawberries, and a Diet Cola. Shortly after midnight, he was strapped to a gurney for lethal injection. Witnesses reported that he appeared calm and even made remarks to prison staff. His final words were blunt. Then something went wrong. One of the intravenous lines failed, delaying the process. For 10 to 18 minutes, technicians struggled to restore the flow, while Gacy remained conscious and restrained. Observers later described the scene as tense and unsettling. When the injection finally resumed, his body went still. At 12:58 a.m., John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead. He was 52 years old. Outside the prison, crowds gathered to celebrate his death. The execution drew criticism not for sympathy, but for its technical failure. It reignited debate over whether capital punishment could ever be carried out cleanly or humanely. For many, Gacy's death closed one chapter, but the images of what was found beneath his home ensured his name would never disappear. Aileen Wuornos was executed on October 9, 2002, in Florida. She was 46 years old. Before that morning, she had spent more than a decade on death row. Between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos was responsible for the deaths of 7 men across Florida. She encountered her victims along highways and rural roads, later claiming she acted in self-defense after being attacked. Investigators rejected that version. Evidence showed that the victims were shot at close range, robbed, and left at isolated locations. Ballistic matches and personal belongings found in Wuornos' possession directly tied her to each crime. She was arrested in January 1991. Her trial quickly drew national attention, not only because of the crimes, but because of her erratic behavior in court. Wuornos was convicted on 6 counts of murder and sentenced to death. Over the years, her mental state deteriorated. She accused prison staff and her own attorneys of conspiring against her, and repeatedly stated that she wanted the execution carried out. In letters to the court, she insisted she was competent and demanded that appeals be stopped. On the morning of October 9, 2002, Wuornos walked calmly into the execution chamber. Witnesses described her as composed and expressionless. She declined a final meal, requesting only a cup of coffee. When asked for her final words, she delivered a cryptic statement claiming she would return, referencing religion and the end of the world. At 9:47 a.m., the lethal injection began. Within minutes, her breathing slowed. At 9:53 a.m., doctors pronounced her dead. Her execution closed one of the most controversial death penalty cases in modern American history. For some, it marked justice for her victims. For others, it raised lasting questions about mental illness, responsibility, and the limits of capital punishment. Aileen Wuornos remains one of the most debated figures in criminal history. Richard Ramirez was sentenced to death, but he was never executed. He died of natural causes while waiting on death row. Known as the Night Stalker, Ramirez carried out a series of attacks across California between 1984 and 1985. His crimes terrorized entire neighborhoods as he broke into homes at night and attacked men, women, and children without pattern or warning. He was arrested in August 1985 after his face appeared on the front pages of newspapers. Members of the public recognized him, chased him, and held him until police arrived. In 1989, Ramirez was convicted of 13 murders, along with multiple additional crimes. The jury sentenced him to death, but the sentence was never carried out. Ramirez entered California's death row system, where the appeals process stretched on for decades. Each conviction triggered automatic appeals, additional motions, procedural delays, and the growing backlog of capital cases in California slowed everything further. During this time, Ramirez remained incarcerated at San Quentin. Life in prison did not isolate him from attention. He received large volumes of mail from admirers and eventually married a woman who had written to him while he was incarcerated. As the years passed, his health deteriorated. Ramirez suffered from B-cell lymphoma, a form of cancer. The disease spread to his liver and lymph nodes, leading to liver failure. He also struggled with chronic infections and long-term health damage. In June 2013, he was transferred to a hospital within the prison system as his condition worsened. Witnesses described him as severely weakened, jaundiced, and barely recognizable. On June 7, 2013, at 9:10 a.m., Richard Ramirez died from complications related to cancer. He was 53 years old. No execution ever took place. No final statements. No closure for the courtroom. For many, his death highlighted a reality of the justice system. Some sentences are handed down but never carried out. Charles Manson is a special case. He was sentenced to death, but he was never executed. Between 1969 and 1970, Manson orchestrated a series of murders carried out by members of what became known as the Manson family. Although he did not physically commit the killings himself, prosecutors argued that he exercised complete psychological control over his followers. The crimes, including the murders at the Tate and LaBianca residences, shocked the United States and marked the violent end of the 1960s counterculture era. Manson's trial became a spectacle. From the very first day in court, he carved an X into his forehead, later turning it into a swastika, declaring that he had been erased by society. His behavior was erratic, theatrical, and designed to dominate attention. The trial of the Manson family became the longest and most expensive criminal trial in U.S. It lasted nearly a year and drew constant media coverage. In 1971, Charles Manson and several of his followers were sentenced to death, but the sentence would never be carried out. In 1972, the California Supreme Court invalidated all existing death penalty sentences in the state, ruling capital punishment unconstitutional as it was applied at the time. As a result, Manson's sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. He spent the next decades moving between high-security prisons, becoming a cultural symbol of manipulation, cult violence, and moral collapse. By the late 2010s, Manson's health had significantly declined. He suffered from intestinal bleeding, respiratory failure, and advanced cancer. In November 2017, he was transferred from prison to a hospital under guard. Staff described him as weak, largely unresponsive, and no longer seeking attention. On November 19, 2017, at 8:13 p.m., Charles Manson died of cardiac arrest, with the respiratory failure and cancer listed as contributing causes. There were no final statements, no courtroom, no execution. Despite never carrying out the murders himself, Charles Manson remains one of the most infamous figures in criminal history. Not for what he did with his hands, but for what he convinced others to do. This time, the story moves far from the United States. Direction: the Soviet Union. Andrei Chikatilo was responsible for one of the longest and most disturbing crime sprees in Soviet history. Between 1978 and 1990, Chikatilo murdered at least 52 women and children across several regions of the USSR, mainly around Rostov-on-Don. For years, he managed to avoid detection. Soviet authorities initially refused to acknowledge the existence of a serial killer, viewing such crimes as a symptom of Western decadence. As a result, early cases were treated as isolated incidents. During the investigation, thousands of suspects were interrogated. Several innocent men were arrested. At least one was executed for crimes Chikatilo later confessed to committing. Chikatilo was finally arrested in 1990, after forensic evidence began linking the killings together. His trial shocked the country. In court, he displayed erratic behavior. He shouted, laughed, insulted judges, and attempted to disrupt proceedings. Behind the spectacle, the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of 52 murders and sentenced to death. Unlike many Western cases, there were no public appeals and no media buildup. On February 14, 1994, Chikatilo was taken from his cell without prior notice, a common Soviet practice. He was led to a small, soundproof room. He was ordered to kneel. A guard placed a firearm behind his head. The execution lasted less than a second. There were no witnesses beyond prison officials. No body was returned to the family. He was buried in an unmarked grave, its location deliberately kept secret. His execution marked a rare moment of closure for a case that had exposed deep failures within the Soviet justice system. Not just the failure to stop one man, but the cost of denial, secrecy, and ideology when faced with violence. This time, the story goes further back in time. Albert Fish was one of the most disturbing figures ever processed by the American justice system. By the time he was arrested in the early 1930s, investigators uncovered a pattern of crimes spanning decades. He targeted children across multiple states, operating quietly and disappearing between incidents. Authorities later linked him to several cases, though Fish himself claimed the true number of victims was higher. His arrest came after the killing of Grace Budd, a 10-year-old girl whose disappearance shocked the nation. What set this case apart was not only the crime itself, but what followed. Fish sent detailed letters to the victim's family after the crime, describing his actions in cold, detached language. Those letters became key evidence in the investigation and later in court. At trial, Fish showed no remorse. He claimed his actions were commanded by divine forces and told psychiatrists that execution would bring him peace. Despite questions about his mental state, the court ruled him competent to stand trial. In 1935, Albert Fish was convicted and sentenced to death. His execution took place on January 16, 1936, at Sing Sing Prison in New York. Witnesses described him as calm. He reportedly assisted guards as they strapped him into the electric chair. When asked for final words, he said he did not understand why he was there. At 11:06 p.m., the current was applied. The execution required multiple electrical cycles, each lasting between 30 and 60 seconds. Doctors later stated death occurred within minutes, though some witnesses believed it took longer than expected. His body was unclaimed and buried in Potter's Field on Hart Island, among thousands of others with no family to claim them. This time, we're going even further back, the oldest execution in this video. H. Holmes is often considered one of the first modern serial killers in American history. In the late 19th century, during the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, Holmes operated a 3-story building later known as the Murder Castle. Inside, investigators would later discover hidden rooms, locked chambers, trapdoors, and soundproof walls. People entered the building and were never seen again. Holmes used charm, deception, and false identities to lure victims, often promising jobs, lodging, or business opportunities. The true number of victims remains uncertain. Official records confirmed at least 9, but estimates at the time ranged anywhere from 20 to over 200. Despite the scale of suspicion, Holmes was ultimately convicted not for the full scope of his crimes, but for the murder of a business associate during an insurance fraud scheme. Even during his trial, he continued lying. He calmly denied responsibility, minimized his actions, and claimed that many deaths were accidents. Few believed him. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. On May 7, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison in Philadelphia, he was led to the gallows. Witnesses noted how composed he appeared. He thanked prison staff for their courtesy. When asked for final words, he again denied wrongdoing. The trapdoor opened, but the execution did not go as planned. The fall failed to break his neck. Instead of an instant death, Holmes slowly lost consciousness as he suffocated. Witnesses reported that he did not struggle. He remained eerily still. He hung there for nearly 20 minutes before doctors finally declared him dead. What happened next was something Holmes had planned himself. He requested to be buried 10 feet underground, inside a coffin encased in concrete, to prevent grave robbers from disturbing his body. For reasons never fully explained, the prison complied. More than a century later, when his grave was exhumed for DNA testing, his body was still remarkably preserved. Even his mustache remained intact. This time, the end didn't come from a court, an execution chamber, or a prison yard. It came from something the entire world lived through. Peter Sutcliffe, better known as the Yorkshire Ripper, terrorized England between 1975 and 1980. Over that period, he murdered 13 women and assaulted at least 7 others across northern England. His crimes paralyzed entire cities. Women were advised not to go out alone. Police forces were overwhelmed. Despite thousands of interviews and an enormous investigation, Sutcliffe managed to evade capture for years, even being questioned multiple times before his arrest in 1981. He was convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment, later transferred to a high-security psychiatric hospital, and eventually returned to prison. For decades, he remained one of the most infamous criminals in British history. And then came the end. No announcement, no crowd, no headlines at first. In November 2020, during the global COVID-19 pandemic, Peter Sutcliffe contracted the virus while incarcerated at HMP Frankland, a maximum security prison in England. His health deteriorated rapidly. On November 13, 2020, he died after refusing further medical treatment. There was no spectacle, no execution, no dramatic final moment, just a hospital ward, medical staff in protective gear, and a death caused by the same virus millions of people around the world feared at the time. For many, it felt unsettlingly ordinary. A man who once caused nationwide terror didn't meet a dramatic end. He faded out quietly during lockdowns, empty streets, and daily death tolls on the news. These were the final moments of some of the most infamous serial killers in history. If one of these cases surprised you, or if you think one of them got off too easy, say it in the comments. If this video helped you understand the darker side of history, leave a like. And if you want more real cases, real mysteries, and forgotten stories, subscribe to the channel. There are still many files left in the dark.